Hi, this is Mark Farnham with Every Believer Confident. I want to talk about one of the most important apologetic questions out there that we often get asked as Christians. And that's the question of how can there be an all-powerful, all-loving God when there's so much evil and suffering in the world? This is probably the number one objection that Christians get asked when they seek to share the gospel. Many times behind the intellectual objections is this objection. You can answer all the questions about how do we know God exists or how do we know the Bible's reliable. And even if you do answer those questions, sometimes behind those questions is the really important one to the person you're talking to, which is, where is God in all the evil and suffering in the world? And that's understandable. As Christians, we wrestle with that as well, don't we? The Psalms are full of cries for God to intervene. So two things we often ask in this question, or even unbelievers ask in this question, is, does God care? And when will he do something about this? So how do we answer that apologetically? Well, some apologists like to go deep into the necessity of evil for God's glory to be magnified, and there's some good thoughts there, but most people I talk to are not asking that question. They're just wanting to be able to make sense of why there is evil and suffering in the world. And of course, as Christians, we believe that the biblical worldview, beginning with the perfect creation of the world and the fall into sin and the subsequent curse that comes upon the world, is the fundamental answer to why we have a world that is broken and fallen. But of course, we want to take that further when we give an answer to those who ask us about this question. So the first thing I do, and this is very common in our approach to apologetics, is to ask questions about the objection. This is a common way to handle objections. First, ask questions before you seek to answer to make sure you understand, but also to challenge those who are asking that question to think about what they are presupposing, that is, assuming to be true without proving it, so that you can clarify whether their objection really is consistent with their own worldview. So let's take someone, for example, who believes that there is no God, that we just came about through a random process of time and chance. Natural selection directs the course of history, and there's no designer behind the universe, no God, no one who loves us, who is coming to save us or has acted to save us. So if that's the case, first I'm going to ask people, what is your explanation for evil and suffering in the world? So I want to put the burden back on them to wonder, how do you answer the problem of evil and suffering? Obviously, if you don't believe in the Christian God, then you have some other explanation for why things are the way they are in the world. And my question is trying to get to the heart of whether your belief is consistent with this question. For example, again, if someone believes in evolution, my question to them is, why are you bothered by evil and suffering? Why do you even call the things that you consider to be bad or tragic? Why do you call those evil? Or why do you think that shouldn't be that way? See, if there is no God and the evolutionary worldview is right, then the world is exactly the way it's supposed to be, right? There's no way it's supposed to be. This is the way it's supposed to be. This is the way natural selection works. Now, you could argue that we as human beings in developing consciousness and rising above other animals, we should know better. But even that assumes that there is a better. Why is it that in the animal world, when predators kill prey, we don't think of that as something wrong with the world? Why then do we turn around and say among humans, when one human kills another, that that's necessarily a problem? Now, I would say as a Christian, I agree with you that the world is not the way it's supposed to be, but that's because that explanation makes sense in my worldview. God did not make the world to include death and illness and destruction and sorrow. That's not the way the world was made. That came about because of the sin of Adam and Eve and the curse that came upon this world from God. So the first thing I want to do is I want to challenge that person. Why do you think it's such a bad thing that there is evil in the world? And how do you call evil what it is? Where do you base that idea of evil? Now, some Christians try to attribute all the evil in the world to simply free will, and certainly free will plays a part in it. But free will is not enough of an answer for the whole thing because all kinds of natural disasters occur. I'm sitting here in October 2024, and we've just had 2 major hurricanes go through the South. So you can blame acts of human evil on free will, but that doesn't explain the other forms of suffering in this world that are natural disasters, the simple process of growing old and dying. So rather than just jumping to explain everything by free will, I want to first, again, challenge the unbeliever to ask them, how do you make sense of this in your worldview? Let's say they're from an Eastern religious background. They might view evil and suffering as an illusion. In Buddhism, suffering is an illusion. You are an illusion. You're actually part of all that exists, the Brahman. And therefore, you must learn to escape the illusion that you exist. You must learn to rid yourself of desire, even the desire to live, even the desire to have desire. You must rid yourself of all that, and that's what the process of following the Buddhistic ways is all about, is that eventually, over time, multiple lives as you're reincarnated, you will be able to escape the illusion that suffering exists, that you exist, and you will be taken up, removed from samsara, the endless wheel of life and death, and you'll be taken up into nirvana and cease to exist. Well, to some people, that's an attractive belief, but I know others who have come to Christ out of Buddhism that say it's just hopeless. I've got to live this life over and over again and suffer and endure with no assurance of when that will take place. Very similar, Hinduism teaches that if you suffer, it's because you deserve it from bad things you've done in past lives, even if you don't remember them. Therefore, you must pay off your karma. And so you live life after life after life suffering in order to pay off your karma. Again, many people that contemplate that they will have to relive lives of suffering over and over endlessly in order to attain enlightenment. It doesn't provide a lot of comfort. Not that something is true because it's comfortable, but something is comfortable because it's true. And the Christian faith offers hope, offers the promise that someday God will rewind all the suffering of this world. And as a friend of mine recently said, all the scars in this lifetime that are occasions of suffering and grief now will be occasions of glory in the eternal state. So before I seek to answer this problem of evil and suffering, I first want to challenge the person who's raising the challenge to me. What do you do with suffering in your worldview? And the truth is, if there is no God, then this is just the way the world works. If Buddhism is right, then you just have to give up the illusion that you're suffering. If Hinduism is right, you just got to buckle down and take whatever suffering you get to pay it off. Most people find that when they think seriously through that to be an unsettling option. See, the truth is, I think everyone intuitively believes that the world is not the way it's supposed to be. And that only makes sense in a Christian worldview. This is one of the reasons why, as Christians, we believe we struggle so much with suffering and death, because we were not made for a world where these things existed, right? Our humanity in Adam and Eve was created for a perfect world, because we are told in Genesis 1 that when God makes the world initially, it is good, it is very good. There's no suffering, no illness, no disease, no sorrow. And even after the fall, and curse falls upon this world, we still struggle with the way the world is. And we still intuitively know, no matter who you are, where in the world, you intuitively wish for a better world. But if there is no God, then there's no need for you to think that the world will be any different than it is now. So many times people struggle because their intuition, their desire for a better world conflicts with their other beliefs that say, there is no God and there's no promise of a better life and a better world. So this is how I would handle, first of all, those who would ask that. Secondly, if someone raises this objection, I will often take the time to want to know, are you going through something? Have you suffered loss? Are you asking this question out of grief and lament and sorrow because of something you've experienced, something you've seen? Why? Because I want them to know that as I seek to give an answer that satisfies this question and this curiosity, to know also that I care, that God cares. God does not take our suffering lightly. In fact, I often turn to John chapter 11 because in that gospel, Jesus shows us the heart of God for suffering. In John chapter 11, we have the story of the raising of Lazarus. And we are told 3 times in the text that Jesus loved Martha and Mary and Lazarus. They were his close friends. And the message comes to Jesus early in the chapter that Lazarus is sick. The sisters, Martha and Mary, send a message to Jesus saying, "Come quickly, he whom you love is ill." And we are told, interesting verse in John 11:3, "So the sisters sent to him, saying, 'Lord, he whom you love is ill.' But when Jesus heard it, he said, 'This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it.'" Now we're told in verse 5, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Verse 6, "So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was." That is, because Jesus loved Lazarus and Martha and Mary, he did not come right away and heal Lazarus. That to us seems counterintuitive. Why would Jesus not go? Obviously, Martha and Mary believed that Jesus could heal. They had probably seen him heal many people. His reputation is that he's going around healing people, casting out demons, healing the lame, restoring sight to the blind. So they send a message to Jesus in belief. Jesus, come because we believe you can do something about our sick brother. But Jesus says several times in this passage, I am not going right now because I want you to believe in me, and this is ultimately for the glory of God. Finally, when Jesus does come into town in verse 17, he comes and Martha comes and says to him, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died." Tim Keller says we need to discern when we're talking to grieving people. Do they need a ministry of truth or a ministry of tears? Here, Martha needed a ministry of truth, and Jesus simply says to Martha, "Your brother will rise again." And Martha says, "I know he will rise again at the last resurrection." And Jesus says to her, "Martha, I am the resurrection." See, the Jewish conception at this time was that the righteous would rise at the end of time, but the thought of someone rising right now seemed to not occur to them. They did not have that concept. And Jesus is giving her truth. I am the resurrection. I am the one who can raise Lazarus from the dead even now. And then he asks her, "Do you believe this?" See, part of the answer to evil and suffering is that God uses suffering and human evil to drive people to God in repentance and faith. If we were given nothing but comfort and glory and butterflies and rainbows all the time, we would not sense a need for God. But suffering sometimes comes so that we can be reminded that we are desperately dependent upon God. Mary comes out a short time later. She falls at Jesus' feet, and she says the same words that Martha did. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." But Jesus doesn't respond to her in the same way that he did to Martha. As Tim Keller says, Mary needed a ministry of tears. Martha, a ministry of truth. Mary, a ministry of tears. We're told Jesus looked around at those weeping over the death of Lazarus, and we are told he is deeply moved in his spirit. Twice in this passage, Jesus is deeply moved in the spirit. And this word is very interesting. It can mean he bellowed in anger. So he might have done something like this, "Ah!" at the thought of death, at the sorrow that he saw around himself. And then we are told in John 11:35, Jesus weeps. This is so important. As Christians, we need to know God's heart for us in suffering, that he is not distant and uninvolved. We do not have a deistic God who sets the world in motion and walks away. We have a God who enters our world, enters our pain, and suffers with us, all the while not diminishing his essence at all. Jesus goes to the tomb and says, "Take away the stone." It's very interesting that Jesus is about to raise Lazarus from the dead, and yet he takes the time to weep. You would think Jesus would walk into town and say, "Don't worry about it, I'm here," and he just raised Lazarus from the dead. But by taking the time to be deeply moved and to weep, Jesus shows us the heart of God. And then he raises Lazarus from the dead. And he prays before he does that and says, Father, I thank you that you've heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you have sent me. See, the ultimate purpose in this passage through suffering is that God is glorified and we believe. Why? Because if we are here to bring God glory, then the greatest fulfillment we can experience is not our own comfort, not a problem-free life, but that we might bring God glory even through our lives, even through suffering, and that we might turn to God in faith, because our greatest need is not to be healed of our present circumstances. And sometimes when people say, why is God allowing this, hurricanes, war, illness, I have to say, I don't know why specifically God is allowing this, but I do know God loves us so much that he has taken care of our greatest need, which is to be reconciled to him, to have the guilt of our sin removed so that we can be reconciled to God. And if God has taken care of my greatest need, then I can trust him in this suffering. I love Romans 8:32. He who did not spare his own son, but delivered him up for us all, how will he not also with him give us all good things? That is, if I can trust God for my greatest need, forgiveness through the atoning death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, then I can trust God through the suffering that I can't make sense of. Maybe you've gone through things and you wonder, why did God do this? I can't make sense of it. I understand that. I've lived with chronic illness for 20 years, needing a kidney transplant, and then a few years ago, having to go through cancer and nearly losing my life. Seeing my mom killed in a car accident out of the blue, a mile from our house, on the way to pick up my wife to go shopping. Short time after that, my father-in-law dropped dead. Time and time again, we've seen things that we cannot make sense of. We don't know why. Sometimes we do know why suffering happens, but many times we don't know why. And I can say to someone who doesn't know Christ, I don't know why God is allowing this in your life, but I do know this. It can't be because he doesn't love you, because he has already given his son. And the only hope is that someday God will undo the suffering of this world and bring us to a place of eternal bliss. And that can be obtained by believing in Jesus Christ. That, my friends, is the only comfort in life and death, is that God will sovereignly restore all things, because he who is willing to punish his own son, his innocent son, for the sake of the guilty, will not overlook our tears and grief. And so I can help a person who is struggling with this problem of evil and suffering and show them, first of all, that struggle only makes sense in the Christian worldview, where we know things are not the way they're supposed to be. But also the promise, because of what Christ has done for us, is that we can be reunited with those that we love that have passed on. We can see the suffering of this world, which is an occasion for grief and sorrow now, turned into an occasion for glory then. My friend, if you are suffering, my heart goes out to you. And I pray that as you wrestle and struggle with that, you might turn to God, find strength in him. If you don't know Christ, that you would turn to Christ as the atoning sacrifice who has made possible the promise of eternal life.